Good morning. As you know, today, church is with his parents, and his mom is celebrating her 90th birthday today. And the Holy Spring. Okay. But anyway, she was ready to get out of the hospital, and so she's ready for a big 90th birthday celebration. So we congratulate Linda on reaching that milestone in her life, and I know that it's big today. He asked me to talk to you for a little bit in this class, and once you know what you're not getting. Number one, there's no way in the world I would ever follow her teaching anything from John. Not the way in the world. Number two, I'm not a trained theologian at all. In fact, I've had no Bible classes because my education was at a sixth. And so, I don't know if any of the rest of you are in that situation or not, but I didn't have Bible school. It was, when you're asked to do something, you better study for it. And that's the way I got my biblical education. Now, what you are getting is someone who has led singing since they were 18 and 8. So I've led singing for a couple of years. And I've led singing in about 3 places in Chile, in Venezuela, in Costa Rica, in Germany. We worship both with the American congregation, primarily military, and also the German congregation, and I led singing for them. They had a lot of laughs about my German, but we got through it anyway. Also, I am not trained as a church musician. My training is not in that at all. My training is in voice. I was trained to be a vocal soloist and a speaker. And how I fell into my first jobs as a choir director, I don't really know, but I ended up doing that for 30 years. And it came to HCU as a director of choral. But I also would not. But that's my first love, and that's what I know most about. just to let you know, you cannot study musicology or music without studying music as a kid. You must. Am I okay? But again, you can't study music history without studying music. That's where the training musician. That's where the development was in music. That's where the development was in simplification. That's where development was in harmony. And the music that we have today is primarily because of what happened in the church of that time. And so, all of music, whatever we have, owes a tremendous amount to music. Now we get to the great composers. What was their connection? Well, they were all very much connected to the church. And a lot of the music that they wrote actually was financed by the church. And so the great masterpieces that we have today, they didn't just go out and write them. They wrote them after they had money so that they could produce them for the church. And the church is one of the very few places that actually had money. And so, again, the church, all the way through history, has been extremely involved with the development of music. Am I still on good? There you go. I could hear me. Okay. I hope you heard all of that. I don't want to try to repeat it because I couldn't. But anyway, like the development of notation and that type of thing, that would not have happened if it hadn't been for the church. And the church was where the educated musicians were. It was not in the general public. Their work with notation and that kind of thing happened way after the church had developed it and begun to develop it. So I want to just give you a brief history, and then I'm going to talk about the different kinds of music we don't often use, but we could use within the churches of Christ. And I want to talk a little bit about why we, in the churches of Christ, sing a cappella. And maybe you get a better idea of why that was looked at as the way to go in part of the group that was in part of our Reformation movement in the United States. And so I would like to give you a little bit of history before we do some singing. And I was hoping that the groups would be fairly divided so that we could sing back and forth to one another. You know, Paul told us to sing to one another, and so we sing to each other's back of our head, and we get no feedback whatsoever unless the person in front of you is totally bald and you have a good reflection. That's the only way you're going to get any feedback in that circumstance. What we do in the churches of Christ is that we sing together. We don't have soloists who get up with accompaniment. And part of it comes from that historical, biblical idea of speak to one another or sing to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Now, I'm going to talk about each one of those individually to designate a little bit of the differences that we find in each one of those. It's important for us to know that Psalms has always been an integral part of the worship in synagogue and also the worship in the church, the early church. And there are many different ways that you can utilize what is happening in the Psalms. Now,
Do we have songs today that we sing that are psalms? Yes. Are they verbatim psalms? There are a few with the words changed a little bit to fit into homophonic kind of music, but there are a few, and we're going to sing at least one of those in a little bit. What about hymns? What's a hymn? Well, a hymn is a religious song that praises God, and today it's often with scriptural references, but it is not divinely inspired as a psalm is. It teaches spiritual lessons, and generally, based on the meter of the poetry, all of the parts move together. Sound familiar? That's kind of what we do. We sing in a manner that was developed in the 17th and 18th century. We haven't grown a lot since then. It's basically the same thing, except not quite as experimental as they were in the 17th and 18th century with it. We tend to use 3 chords. That makes it easy for people to sing. And maybe that goes back to Martin Luther, who wanted the congregation to sing and for the congregation to be involved. Before that, it was primarily the trained musicians. And once we got to Luther, his idea was we're going to read the Bible together in the church, and we're going to sing together the way we're supposed to. And so music began to be composed so all of us could sing together and speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. What about a spiritual song? That sounds just kind of like a gathering net for everything else. And in some ways it is. But there is something that is really important in that. It's believers expressing their own personal faith through the spiritual song as they write the poetry. It may not directly praise God the way a psalm does, but it often it will teach important spiritual lessons. These songs might express the joy of salvation. It may teach the beauty of grace and what grace has meant to my life. Not a scriptural reference necessarily, but grace in my life. What has it done for me? And a lot of the contemporary songs are those kinds of expressions. Are they valid? Absolutely, they're valid. Now, I don't really like that kind of music. I have to admit, I'd rather go to the opera and listen to the opera. But they do have value, particularly with some of the Christians today. And in that case, have at it. I know my son, when I get in the car with him, this is Randy, he has contemporary music going all the time. It's not pop, sounds pop to me, but it's spiritual music. And you know what really confuses me? He knows every lyric, and he sings right along with it. I don't know any of the lyrics, and that says something about me that I ought to probably be more in tune with some of those songs, because they do express spiritual ideas and our life in Christ, and I think that's really important. These Christian ideals that are espoused in those songs are ones that we can live by and show us how to utilize those in our daily lives, and I think it's really important for us to be aware of that. What about history and scripture in relationship to a cappella music? Anyone know what a cappella means? Well, almost in the chapel, but in the church. It's music that we knew was going to be in the church. When we sing a cappella, what do we sing? Songs without accompaniment. Well, why would that be related to the chapel or to the church? Because they didn't have any instruments for a long time. Why do we follow that practice? Or why did the early church follow that practice? Number one, and somebody who is more of a church scholar might point out my incorrectness about this, but synagogue worship never utilized instruments. And what were the Jewish people who were converted most familiar with? The synagogue. And so that tradition and that practice was brought over to the early church. Were there instruments available? Oh, absolutely. All over the place. We know that when Rome burned, what did Nero do? He said, we always say he played the fiddle. No, he didn't, probably. He played the lyre, a harp. But anyway, instruments were available. Trumpets, the shofar, and I meant to bring my shofar so you could see it. It's just a ram's horn is really all it is. But it was used in Jewish practice and in Jewish worship, but it was used primarily in the temple, later drawn over into synagogue worship as well. But when they went to the temple, there were all kinds of instruments. But what was the difference? Synagogue, everyone gathered. Temple, Levites, trained, knew how to play instruments, knew how to make music, and that was the big difference between the two. Another thing in the very early part of the church is that the pagans utilized instruments in their worship, and that was anathema to the early church. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with any connection to paganism, and so that was dropped by the wayside. When did we first begin to see an instrument in the history of the church as it developed through the centuries? Some will say 666. That sounds like an ominous number. But somewhere in the 7th century, we find the first mention of an organ being used. Was it common practice? Absolutely not. The church looked on it askance. They really didn't want much to do with it. And so it didn't really come into full practice until 100 to 150 years later, when they began to use it more fully, and they began to accept it. Again, you know, a lot of times we think, well, we're the only ones that ever did a cappella music, and we're the only ones that ever had any special reasons for it. Well, the early church had some significant reasons for it, and it was important to them to make sure that they sang with their voices and that they utilized psalms and hymns and spiritual songs in praise and in celebration and in teaching. All of those things were extremely important. What about harmony? Today we have 4-part harmony. Some churches now are using instrumental music, and they think they're not using the harmony, but all it is a solo line and harmony, just like what we do. The church eventually, after about the middle of the 16th century, 17th century, and on, began to go to what is called homophonic music. And that's what we primarily sing today. But the beginnings of the church was not that. It was monophony, or a single line melody. Any of you ever heard of Gregorian chant? Okay, it's plain song. It was named after Pope Gregory in about 600, but it was only because he put out the edict to codify all the different chants to make it more easy to pull things for a particular service. But it was a cappella, and it was a single line melody. There was no harmony. Well, when did harmony begin to happen? Well, interestingly enough, somewhere around the 9th century, we begin to see the development of it. And at first, they would take an old plain song, and they would start on the plain song and sing a few of the notes on the plain song for a little bit, and then gradually divide until they had an interval of a fourth or a fifth, but usually a fourth, and then they would follow the line of the plain song all the way through. I don't know if any of you have ever listened to parallel organum before, but that is some weird stuff. If you're used to what we hear are chords that have thirds and sixths, and that's harmony to us. And can you imagine what the congregation did the first time they heard the monks come in and sing parallel organum, where they started off in the chant? Oh, I love that chant, because they actually knew them, and they frequently would sing certain kinds of things with them. And then all of a sudden it goes to this weird sounding interval of the fourth. There must have been an uprising within the congregation. I can only imagine. In order to help the monks to remember, because there were so many different things going on, they had to find some kind of notation. And so about this time, the 9th or 10th century, they also began notation, and it was called a neume. And I don't know if any of you have seen a neume before, but it's just a weird little thing. It looks kind of like a square note, but it has different kinds of things on it. I took a class one time to learn how to read neumes. I'm glad they didn't grade me on it, because it was not easy to figure out. I tried, in fact, I tried diligently, but most people in the class were not really that successful. We were able to sing a few little simple things, but that was it. But the notation developed very quickly. And then we get to the time of Luther. And when were the 95 Theses nailed to the wall at Wittenberg? Anyone remember? Okay, 1519 maybe. So in the 16th century, but by the 17th century, guess what? All of the emphasis on congregational singing had caused a blossoming of homophonic music, because they needed something that was fairly simple for all of the congregation to sing. In addition to that, the organ came into being at that time. It was used all the time. How many of you have heard of J.S. Bach? He comes out of that evangelisch or Lutheran congregations because he was writing music not only for the congregation, usually one chorale, but the rest of it was for trained singers. And so they moved very quickly to music that was too difficult for the congregation to sing, but they were always included. Sometimes a chorale at the beginning, sometimes a chorale at the end, that was all in four-part harmony and very easy for them to sing. But the emphasis always was on the idea of congregational singing in some place or another within the congregation. Today, we have some congregations that are using instruments in music, and people frequently ask me about that. What do I think about it? Well, I prefer a cappella singing. because you can better hear the fullness of everyone's voices. And as long as people sing, but if they don't sing, then, you need some assistance somewhere along the line. And maybe that's the reason why we went that direction. I would like for us to explore just a little bit about what kind of singing we might have in the church, some of which we use all the time, some of which we never use. Now, what are the kinds of singing that we might use? Monophony, what is that? One line. Unison. Do we ever use unison singing in the church? Very infrequently. Is it powerful? I think it's very powerful for us to all sing the same thing at the same time and really bring our voices together to proclaim a message. And so it's important for us to realize, yes, we can unison sing. And we don't do that very often. Usually what I hear when I ask for a certain part to be sung in unison, some people will be trying to sing parts in it, as if, the parts are holy. They're not. They're accompaniment to a melody. They're not independent. The other thing is that we can sing what I call and what is called antiphonally. What is that? To sing antiphonally. Okay, I'm going to show you in just a minute. We're going to sing in unison, and then I'll show you what that means. And what about polyphony? Do we ever use polyphony? That's two lines that are separate melodies sounded together. Do we have any songs like that you can think of? Yeah, we have a few, and we avoid them like the plague. Why? Because it's hard. Yeah, there you go. Yes. Oh, okay. It's the same thing that I hear all the time. Well, I can't sing. I don't think God cares. You just go ahead and sing. It's a heart religion. Let me. The person next to me cares. Yes. Well, let me tell you about my father-in-law. I have taught many people how to match pitches. And some of the students in classes that I've taught when I was first beginning, I had a methodology that I used to help them be able to match pitches. I'd have them sing a pitch, and then I'd play that pitch, and I said, see, you're matching a pitch. And then I would say, okay, now go up a little bit. I'd play that pitch. And then they would begin to practice, and they could start to match pitches. My father-in-law, sing a pitch. I couldn't find a pitch to match. Once he did sing one, I did it. I said, okay, now sing another pitch. Same pitch. Once he got stuck on it, that was it. But one thing I loved about Clyde Dilbeck is that he was a wonderful Christian man, an elder in the church. He would often sit down close to the front, and you could hear him all over the church building, but it was nowhere close to the tune, nowhere close to the harmony, but he sang with joy, and he sang with a nice full voice, and God heard that as beautiful. And so we need to keep that in mind as, I don't sing. Well, why don't you sing? I can't match pitches. I don't want to speak for God here, but I don't think he cares. I think he wants you to sing from the heart and the mind and the voice that he gave you. And so a lot of times we just kind of mumble when we sing. Shame on us. We ought to be like at the delivery of the Israelites from Pharaoh after they crossed